Welcome to another video of Stat 212. In this video, we're going to introduce different types of observational studies. An observational study, as a reminder, is going to be different than an experiment. So in an experiment, we have kind of the power to control our treatment factor in terms of how it's administered, whether or not we assign people to a particular treatment factor or not. That's something that kind of we have in our power. In an observational study, we don't have that power. All we can do is observe what happens. In other words, there are people who experience one particular situation. Some people are experiencing another situation, and we simply observe what happens in those cases and if there happen to be any differences. But because we can't kind of control the environment, because we can't ensure that all other relevant factors are held constant, all we can do is observe any association, but we can't necessarily say that the treatment factor is the cause, because that may not be the only thing that's different in these two situations. It's just something that is different, but may be associated with something else that could actually be the cause. So for that reason, observational studies are going to be a little bit weaker. They're not going to have strong internal validity in most cases because of that possibility. So let's talk about three different observational study formats. So a cross-sectional study is probably the easiest one to understand. It's probably the one that you would think most often if you had to think of one. That would just be a standard survey type situation where you're collecting data for both the potential cause and the potential effect together. So you might think of it as data at a cross-section. So if we were to ask a survey, we would gather that information kind of together. So that would be different than a cohort study. So a cohort study is when I identify people who have a shared characteristic, condition, or risk factor, and maybe I have several cohorts. In other words, several groups of people that have, like each group is a little bit different. And I'm curious if those differences could be related to a particular response. However, if it's an observational study, then I didn't actually assign people to these groups. All I did was observe people who just happen to be, who happen to have these different characteristics. So there are things that I can't actually control the administration of. There are things that I can't control the environments of. I simply observe that these differences exist. And then at a later point in time, I can observe to see if there's a difference in response between these different groups. But again, I can't necessarily say it's because of this characteristic of interest. All I can note is that there might be an association that people in this group tend to be more likely to also have this result. But causation is a lot trickier to parse out there. Cohort studies are commonly prospective in form. They don't have to be, but oftentimes that's what's going on, meaning that we observe this causal, potential causal difference, like these different groups, and then over time later we observe the response. A case control study would be kind of the opposite, meaning that I observe the response first, and then I look for differences. I look for possible causal effects, different characteristics. So in other words, I identify people into the study because they have certain outcomes. Maybe it's like, well, these people had a heart attack, and here are some people who didn't have a heart attack. Let's dig in and see if we can find some differences between these two groups of people that might explain, what do people who have a heart attack have more in common versus people who don't have a heart attack might have in common. Case control studies are often retrospective in form. They don't have to be. But again, that's a very common situation in this case where all the data, or like all the information has already happened, or like all the events have already happened, and I'm just finding this information out after the fact. So the reason that we make these distinctions between these different types of observational studies is because it can affect what type of analysis I might do and what issues might be at play in this design. So as we'll talk about later in the course, case control studies in particular are a little bit trickier to analyze based on how the data was collected and based on some possible biases about who I would have in the study and how they represented a larger population. But we talk about that in another chapter for the most part. All you really need to know right now is we have 3 different observational study formats. Cross-sectional is where I kind of collect the data all at the same time. It's data at a cross-section. A cohort study is where I first identify these characteristics, these differences, a possible causal agent here, and then I observe later if there's differences in responses between these groups. And then a case control study is where I observe the outcome. I observe these possible kind of results, and then I try to trace back and see if I can find differences, some possible causal effects that are shared between people in each of these different response groups.